For around 20 years now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has worked to update the world's tax system as companies make more and more money and find ways to hide that money. But as the pact that has more than 137 countries on board is expected to come into effect in 2023, Africa's largest economy is holding out and says it will not join the bandwagon. From Nigeria, we'll also be in South Africa, where the country's Competition Commission claims companies in the insurance industry have been in collusion to fix prices for more than 30 years. Those conversations are top of our agenda today on Business Edge, but let's get you the latest African business headlines first. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. Ghana's domestic debt exchange program, as it currently stands, will have an impact on more than 7.5 million policies, according to the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana. This is due to the fact that more than 40% of insurance premiums are invested in government securities, primarily bonds. The company's president, Solomon Lartey, says that if the sector is not exempted from the program, the swap program will aggravate underwriting losses by insurance businesses. He also pointed out that confidence in the insurance industry will be eroded if government goes ahead to implement the program in its current form. He further warned that the debt exchange program will worsen the penetration rate of the insurance industry, which is less than 2%. According to the Ghana Insurers Association, insurance firms lost 356 million cedis in underwriting in the third quarter of 2022. Across the continent, the Central Bank of Kenya is confident that the current high cost of living will ease by March. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the CBK's Governor Patrick Njoroge said inflation is expected to fall within its target range of 7.5% in the first quarter of 2023 on sound monetary measures. Kenya's inflation in December dipped to 9.1%, still above the bank's target range of 2.5 to 7.5%. Kenya, just like other economies globally, hiked base lending rates 3 times in 2022 to slow down rising inflation. In November, the Central Bank's Monetary Policy Committee raised the central bank rate from 8.25 to 8.75%. The East African region will be at the forefront of boosting the continent's growth between 2023 and 2024. A report by the African Development Bank on the continent's growth projection pointed out that the region is projected to record the highest growth this year across Africa's sub-regions. East Africa is projected to grow by an average of 5% ahead of other regions. North and Central Africa have growth projections of 4.3%, while West Africa is expected to grow 4.1%, and Southern Africa comes in at the lowest, with growth only expected to average 2.3%. And now we'll go to a breaking story coming out of Lagos, Nigeria. We're heading into, of course, the Murtala Mohammed International Airport. Correspondent Ben Akede is standing by on the line right now. And it seems that thousands of passengers are stranded at the airport. Ben, good morning to you.
Good morning, Tolu. You're very correct. Thousands of passengers are stranded at the departure wing, both the new departure and the old departure wing at the Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos, Nigeria. Thousands and thousands of passengers stranded here with their luggage, waiting for information as to when their flights eventually will take off.
Okay, so what do we know about what is causing the delays right now? You talk about those waiting for their flights to take off. What about those who have even been coming in on flights since morning or maybe even late yesterday evening?
Yes, so just like those who are waiting to take off, those who have arrived, according to information reaching me, is that those who have arrived are also stranded at the airport here at several places, particularly the arrival wing of this international airport. Now, the reason for this, as far as I've been able to gather, is that the group called NACO is an acronym for Nigerian Aviation Handling Company. Now, NACO is responsible for handling everything concerning the airlines, from cleaning of the airplane to baggage handling to cargo movement. You know, everything concerning the airlines and the aircraft is what NACO is about. That they are the ones who are holding down activities this morning. NACO decided to go on an industrial action this morning. The reason for that is not yet fully known. As at the time we arrived here, we are told that there's a meeting that's ongoing between NACO officials and FAN, that's Federal Airport Authority of Nigeria management staff. That meeting is currently ongoing. We're waiting for the results of the meeting. We've tried to speak to management personnel here, but none has spoken to us just yet. I believe that they are still waiting for results of the meeting. But while that is going on, passengers are definitely, unhappy, and they are very, very discomforted at the moment. Many of them have been complaining, not on camera, but they've been complaining about how no information was given prior to this, and how they've been made to stand here for long hours under the scorching sun, just waiting for any information at all as to which flights are being grounded, which one will be allowed to fly, and when eventually they will be allowed to fly.
So was there any prior notice of this strike happening on a Monday morning, one of the first, of course, weeks into the new year as it may be? Any notice, any warning for the officials of the Federal Airports Association of Nigeria or even for passengers?
As a matter of fact, Tolu, I asked the same question when I arrived here, and from what I gathered, there was no prior warning as to this strike taking place today. But it seems like it was a strategic decision to ground flights today. If you remember, the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, is in Lagos, Nigeria, to commission several projects across the city, and one would have thought, this seems like a strategic decision to ground flights on a day when the president will be in town. That's one. Two, like you clearly stated, it's quite early in the year. Today is only the 23rd, I beg your pardon, day in the month of January, the first month of the year. So to ground flights at this time, it looks like it's something that has been in the works, by NACO staff and officials. But of course, others didn't know about it. And that's why it really caught people unawares and hit people really, really hard. Particularly because this is Lagos, one of the busiest airports, not just in Nigeria, but across the West African sub-region.
All right, so right now have no idea how long this could last, no official communications. So Ben, we expect you're probably going to be there until we do hear what comes from that meeting. Am I correct?
Definitely, so wait and see how much information I can get and for how long this would linger on.
Thank you so much, Bernard Akede, standing by at the Lagos International Airport, Murtala Mohammed International Airport. But this strike right now by the Nigeria Aviation Company, handling company, seems to be affecting both the local and international airport, with passengers in their thousands, Ben is saying, being stranded because they can't board some flights, and flights that have come in, passengers are unable to leave because they can't get their luggage. We'll be following very closely, and I know throughout the day we'll have updates for you. And of course, that has to wrap up our African business headlines at this time. When we come back after this break, Nigeria is saying no once again to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development's Global Tax Pact. We'll get into the reasons that Nigeria's Minister of Finance noted at the World Economic Forum in Davos. That comes up after the break. After raising concerns and delaying its signing of a historic global tax deal, it looks like Nigeria will not jump on board the bandwagon of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's tax pact. Nigeria's Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed, while speaking on a panel at the World Economic Forum in Davos, said that not only were the negotiations not concluded on an equal footing, but they favored wealthy economies and created rules that are too complex for Nigeria to effectively implement. Nigeria has not been the only major holdout on the continent. Kenya, too, has raised concerns about the deal before now. Outside of the continent, there are still a few holdouts who share some of the concerns that Nigeria's finance minister spelt out. Nigeria's decision has raised questions about the potential impact on the economy and its relationship with the international community. The global tax deal, which aims to combat tax evasion and increase transparency in international tax matters, has been endorsed by more than 130 countries. Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC Nigeria, joins me now to look at the decision Nigeria has taken and the possible ramifications of that decision. Taiwo, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu. It's a pleasure to be on the program.
So it's been a little over 1 year since around 130 countries finally agreed to the sweeping overhaul of the global tax system. And this is premised on a 15% global minimum tax. So just take us back a little bit. Again, this is something that's been in the works for about 2 decades, if not more, in terms of amending the global tax rules. But what was really wrong with everything, with how things were going? Why did it become necessary to make this amendment, especially with how it affects multinational companies?
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe starting point for me would be to say that it's not like Nigeria is not going to be a part of the global agreement. It's just that there's a particular aspect of it that Nigeria does not agree to. So Nigeria is one of those countries that are included in what they call the OECD Inclusive Framework, about 140 countries. Nigeria continues to be a member, and many of the proposals that are coming from that inclusive framework by the OECD, Nigeria indeed subscribed to them. So essentially, there are two broad, proposals. One is called Pillar One. Pillar One is on profit allocation that says that for a multinational company, if you make a lot of money from different countries around the world, we need to ensure that you pay taxes in those market jurisdictions. So rather than sometimes taking them to a tax haven where there are no tax rates or the tax rates are small, or where you pay the taxes in your home country rather than the host countries where is really where the market is. That is the particular pillar one that the Nigerian government are not comfortable with. There's pillar two, which is global minimum tax. To be honest, I don't see any reason why Nigeria will not, want to do something about pillar two. Having said that, the whole concept of, this pillar one, pillar two, and the global reform in terms of how taxes are paid, particularly by multinationals, was a question that started, far back 2005 or thereabout, about tax morality. And then that evolved into a global agenda because it was immediately acknowledged that no single country can solve that problem because it is a global issue where cooperation is needed. So initially it was G7, then G20, then the OECD took it on board and wanted to make it more global and inclusive, and then invited many other countries, including Nigeria, to join. Now, essentially, some of the reasons why Nigeria did not sign is first and foremost, if you think about it, the rules, they set a very high, extremely high threshold. Before any of the global companies can even fall under these arrangements, they have to make turnover of 20 billion euros. So that's not so many countries around the world that are able to make 20 billion euros in turnover. So rough estimates suggest that there are probably about 100 or slightly less companies around the world that will cross that threshold. In fact, it's even more complicated because the rule says not only would you have 20 billion euro turnover, you must be profitable, at least making 10% of your turnover as the profit. So that again means that many of those companies will drop off. Now, in addition to making 10% of profit, of at least 20 billion turnover, only 25% of the profit above that 10% is what they will share to the rest of the world. Just to put it in perspective, if a multinational makes a turnover of $10 billion and then their profit is 1.2 billion, that's 12% profitability. So they'll fall on that threshold, so not even 10 billion, because 10 billion dollars would be lower than the example I gave because it's 20 billion euros. Let's say they make, $50 billion turnover. And out of that, 50 billion turnover, let's say their profit is around, let's say 10, so 10 means about 20%. Now, you take half of that, which is the excess amount over 10, which is, 5 billion, then you take 25% of that amount. By the time you finish dicing it, the percentage of the profit of these global giants that you want to share is effectively less than, even 5% of the amount. So this is the concern that countries like Nigeria, Africa, and the rest of the developing world actually has, to say, why are we not sharing the whole profit? Why are we sharing residual? And why is it that the basis for reallocating it to developing countries seem to be, in a way, giving them whatever is left out of the crumbs, rather than really recognizing that a lot of activities, commercial activities, take place in these developing countries. That's the major reason why you have that pushback by countries such as Nigeria.
I think you've gotten to the parts where the minister said that it seems to serve more the interests of richer countries than it does any other person. And even in terms of serving those interests, we can't forget that this is a deal that may not go forward if it doesn't even pass the U.S. Congress. So you have a sort of structure where it has to be signed off on by some of the wealthier nations in the world, but the concerns of small, developing, emerging economies, and even countries like Ireland that have something to do with Facebook and all of these multinational digital companies are sort of pushed to the side. So do you really see that as a fair criticism when you lay out the structure and, of course, those who need to sort of sign off before this really takes effect in 2023?
Yeah, I do agree. I think it's the reality because the US in particular feels like this is really an attack on them for the mere fact that most of these multinationals are US companies. I think maybe even more than half of them globally are US companies. So the US would feel like they're trying to attack their own tax base and their corporations. So that is the perspective from which the US is looking at it. And a lot of the final drafts, of these treaty, had significant input from the US because the rest of the world is well aware that if you don't carry the US along, then this will not work. The US says, no, I'm not part of it. Then really, what do you do? Because you can't extend your jurisdiction to another country to enforce, any rules. That's why you need a cooperation of countries to make this work. And on the other hand, you have countries like the island, where for them, they have really looked at their tax rates and they've decided to be very competitive to the extent that they could attract many of these global companies. And then people then question them to say, why are you attracting them to your country and they are putting their profits here and you're collecting a small portion of it, whereas they should have paid a lot more wherever they're supposed to pay those taxes. I wouldn't blame Ireland. They were doing what they thought was good for their economy. So, but then it means that these issues become complicated because how do you then bring everybody on board? And we haven't even talked about the tax havens, small islands here and there, that they think for them the only way they can survive is have the attractive tax regime, attract multinationals and make some money in the process. But then overall, this could be to the detriment of the entire global economy and more particularly the countries where those multinationals carry out their businesses. So criticism, whether they could have done it differently, I'm not sure. I think it's really more about when you go into a negotiating table, you go with all your arsenal. So I don't think that the party you are discussing with has any obligation to ensure that they take care of you. That's your responsibility to do. Unfortunately, when these conversations come up, it's always that Africa and the rest of the developing world are unable to match up the kind of resources that the developed countries are able to deploy to negotiate, to make sure that they do take care of themselves, first and foremost, before the rest of the world.
And that brings me to an interesting development which happened late last year, I believe around November, and that was African countries at the United Nations also bringing this conversation of tax rules and taxation and global tax revenue to the UN. And we saw that they really pressed for a resolution on that, even though at the end of the day it passed and there's still no vote and not too much movement. But when you talk about Africa going as a bloc, Kenya, Nigeria in particular have been very vocal about this, and they believe that they'll actually be on the losing end of things if the OECD way doesn't work. Do you think Africa as a group, as a bloc, has a way forward in terms of taxation conversations, possibly at the United Nations?
What I was even hoping was going to happen, imagine now in Africa, not every country was even invited to join that table, So, but out of the countries that were invited, of course, the largest economies in Africa, it's only Nigeria and Kenya that haven't signed. All the other countries that were invited signed. So imagine if Africa has refused to sign, to say we have a voice and we need you to hear us. The African Tax Administrators Forum put a very compelling position together for Africa, but they are not a country. So they don't have a seat at the table. They were depending on the African countries to, project those voices so that they can be heard and so loud enough that it cannot be ignored. But that didn't happen. So when you now leave, already you are divided as a continent. So how much can you push? So, but if you get to a point where Africa can have a harmonized position about what they want and be realistic about it, I'm not suggesting that Africa should then request that all the profits of these multinationals should come to their continent. but something that is fairer, more balanced, and equitable, and then project that forward as one continent, and maybe find allies, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, a few other countries that are also very strong and share the burden of what we are going through in Africa. Then that way, it might be a lot stronger in my view. Clearly, the United Nations platform is more balanced generally when it comes to tax matters because they tend to look at the whole world rather than just the OECD that tends to focus only on the developed countries.
All right, so let's look at what possible consequences there could be for Nigeria continuing to hold out. And some observers have said that Nigeria's decision could actually set a precedent for other countries to opt out of the deal, as it wants to protect its domestic tax policies and ability to collect taxes from medium-sized businesses. And others argue that it could also harm Nigeria's ability to attract foreign investment. So in terms of this decision, where do you think it will land for Nigeria? Because when you really look at it in terms of protecting Nigeria's domestic tax policies, we've had these conversations for the past few years now, the Finance Act, taxation and things like that. And you've been a critic of how Nigeria has been handling its tax structure and its regime and multiple taxation and levies. Is this really something that we should not be part of? Are there really far-reaching or even small consequences for Nigeria not being part? Or do we gain by holding on to our domestic policies and letting the rest of the world go the way of Pillar 1 of the OECD?
There will certainly be consequences. Luckily, those consequences are not going to be very significant, at least in the short to medium term. For example, the US doesn't seem to care about what we're doing. We all recall that when France wanted to do a similar thing, like what we were doing in Nigeria and the rest of Africa, the US immediately took that on board and said, no, we see this as an attack on us. And it became something very diplomatic in terms of the confrontation. So, but because I think maybe we're smaller, so the US particularly is not, saying anything about the fact that we haven't signed, even though they would love for us to have signed. And so what I think is missing really is that strategic, broad-based, vision for the tax system, where if you decide that you're not signing, because I do agree with the reasons why Nigeria has not signed, but the question is, so what? And then what follows? What happens next? So you have the local, domestic legislation around significant economic presence, which Nigeria has introduced, and that's Nigeria's unilateral way of trying to tax multinationals. Now, on one hand, that can be justified because you can say, well, I need to take care of my tax base. On the other hand, if you're not careful how that's implemented, you can then discourage, direct investment, because a multinational company will say, why do I have to pay all these global minimum tax that everybody is saying I have to allocate my profit here and there? And on top of that, I have to pay an extra amount in Nigeria. So when they do the analysis, if it doesn't make sense for them, or being elsewhere is more profitable for them, then they will not come to Nigeria. That is the dimension about it. We don't know how that will play out, but it is the responsibility of government to use the available data they have to ensure that at the end of the day, whatever decisions they make, which is you're trying to make your own local legislation, you're trying to take part of what the global treaty is saying, it has to be in the overall interest of your own economy and just being fair also to the rest of the world. So hopefully, whatever negative impacts and consequences will arise from Nigeria not signing this treaty would be, lower than the benefit that we'll get from going alone and trying to introduce some policy measures on our own. Because one of the requirements for these global, agreements is that once you sign up to it and you adopt those principles, you have to roll back your own individual measures if you already have them. And if you do not have them, you cannot introduce those policies, because the whole principle is you can't share from the global pot and be cooking your own soup by the side that reduces the size of that global pot. So that is the way I'll put it. I know one other area where Nigeria disagreed was the dispute resolution, where the global treaty was suggesting that if you have any issues with any of the multinationals, the dispute resolution will be done internationally, almost like taking away your power to decide your affairs when it comes to tax matters. So those are some of the areas where Nigeria and some of other developing countries disagree with the treaty.
All right, Taiwo, finally, before I let you go, one of the other things that has come out, maybe not necessarily a priority for Nigeria, but for some of the other countries, is that it's going to be a while before this pact is reviewed. So it's likely going to take effect in 2023, and then review won't be at least until 2030. And many are concerned that with such a globally sweeping, changing, sort of multi-layered and complex pact that's coming to be, 7 years is a long time to wait for review. When you look at the timeline and you look at some of Nigeria's concerns, is there a way to bring Nigeria back to the table? Is that 7 years too long? And can there be amendments? Because we know that 15% was not the initial plan. That was after the U.S. and some of the other countries where these multinationals are based raised noise. And it was, I think, around 25 or 30% that there was. And then they reached 15%. Is there a way to make this more palatable for a country like Nigeria? Very briefly.
Yeah, I should think so. You are right. It wasn't 15% initially. And the ATAP, Africa Tax Administrators Forum, were even proposing at least 20%, because in many of the African countries, the rates are already much higher than 15%. So I do think that, hopefully, OECD will want Nigeria's voice to be on the table, and we won't have to wait until 2030 for us to, because even though the reviews are going to happen, in about 7 years' time, there's nothing that says you cannot join midway if there are modifications to those concerns that have been raised by developing countries, including Nigeria.
For now, we know, in as much as anything else, Nigeria's voice is a very powerful, loud voice on the continent. But in this situation, we hope that our voice will not be drowned out. Taiwo, Oyedele, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And it is a conversation that's been on, as I said, for more than 20 years. About a year ago, we actually spoke to one of the executive directors of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development about the pact and why it was time to overhaul the global tax system. And there are some valid points there. But when countries like Nigeria and Kenya say this simply is not made for them, nor does it work for them, will the world hear them? And it's a conversation we hope to be following up to the point of implementation in 2023. You're, of course, watching Business Edge right here on News Central. There's much more coming your way, but up next is International Business Headlines.